According to official records, this building was constructed in the late 19th century. Its date is clear, its documentation is complete, its place in history seems settled, but the building itself tells a different story. The stone blocks show erosion patterns that usually take centuries, not decades. The foundation appears far deeper than required for the structure above it, and the building fits its surroundings as if it had already been there long before the date assigned to it. This isn't about style or aesthetics. It's about behavior. New buildings behave differently from old ones. They settle differently. They weather differently. They integrate into a city differently. Yet, many structures officially labeled as new for their time already appear ancient the moment they enter historical records, not worn, not damaged, but established, as if they were inherited. Once you notice this, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Entire districts are filled with buildings dated to a narrow historical window. Yet, they display construction maturity that suggests a much longer existence. What unsettles me is not that dates could be wrong. It's that so many buildings seem to arrive in history already complete, already integrated, already aged, which raises a quiet but uncomfortable question. Do these dates tell us when the buildings were built, or when they were simply recorded? Because those two moments are not always the same. To understand why so many buildings don't align with their official dates, we need to look at how those dates are created in the first place. Contrary to what many people assume, architectural dates are rarely determined by scientific analysis. They are assigned administratively based on permits, property records, tax documents, renovation logs, ownership transfers. In other words, a building's construction date often reflects the earliest surviving paperwork, not the moment the structure was physically built. This system works when records are continuous, but history is rarely continuous. Archives burn, cities are rebuilt, governments collapse, entire administrative systems reset. When that happens, later authorities reconstruct timelines using what remains and what seems reasonable. If a building first appears in records in 1850, it becomes an 1850 building, even if the structure itself predates that record by decades or centuries. From a bureaucratic perspective, this makes sense. From a physical perspective, it creates contradictions because stone does not reset when documentation does. Foundations preserve age through settling and stratification. Masonry reveals tool marks and construction techniques. Mortar compositions change across centuries in ways that are measurable. And many buildings officially dated to the 19th century show physical characteristics that do not align with known construction practices of that era. Foundations deeper than required. Stonework more consistent than typical for rapid industrial construction. Structural integration with underground systems that predate modern utilities. These are not cosmetic details. They are engineering decisions. Another complicating factor is restoration. Cities often inherit older structures and adapt them. Walls are repaired. Facades are updated. Upper levels are added. When this happens, the date of restoration quietly replaces the date of origin. On paper, the building becomes new. In reality, it remains old. From my perspective, this is where timelines begin to blur. Because once reuse becomes normalized, history starts recording occupation, not creation. Buildings are dated when they re-enter use, not when they first came into existence. And when that distinction disappears, entire architectural eras can appear suddenly fully formed and inexplicably advanced, which leads to a deeper issue. If many buildings were inherited rather than constructed from scratch, then the question is not why they look older than their dates. The question is why the dates focus on paperwork instead of stone, when documents and materials tell different stories. One of them is usually wrong. Paper reflects administration. Stone reflects time. And when it comes to ancient buildings, those two timelines often diverge. Official records may tell us when a building was registered, renovated, or repurposed, but materials tell us how long a structure has physically existed in the world. Stone does not age quickly. Weathering patterns develop slowly, influenced by exposure, climate, and orientation. Erosion takes decades to become visible, and centuries to become structural. Settling in foundations happens over long periods, leaving measurable signatures in the way walls shift and floors tilt. Many buildings, officially dated to the 19th century, already display material characteristics typically associated with much older structures. Their stone blocks show rounded edges rather than sharp cuts. Mortar has fully carbonated, a process that cannot be rushed. Foundations have settled uniformly, suggesting long-term stability rather than recent construction. These are not subjective impressions. They are physical processes. No amount of paperwork can accelerate carbonation. No administrative decision can deepen foundation stratification. And no renovation can replicate centuries of environmental exposure. This is where the conflict becomes impossible to ignore. If documents say new, but materials say old, something in the timeline is missing. One explanation is misdating, another is reuse. In many historical contexts, it was common to build upon existing structures rather than demolish them. Older buildings were reinforced, expanded, or repurposed, not replaced. When this happened, the visible structure might change, but the material core remained. Over time, records tracked ownership and function, not origin. From my perspective, this explains why so many buildings feel older than their official dates. They are not anomalies, they are palimpsests, surfaces rewritten without erasing what lies beneath. And when history records the rewrite as the beginning, the earlier chapter disappears. What makes this especially compelling is consistency. These material contradictions appear across regions, climates, and cultures. Different governments, different archival systems, yet the same mismatch repeats. That suggests a systemic issue, not isolated error. It suggests that much of what we call architectural history is anchored to documentation convenience rather than material reality. And when that happens, stone becomes the more reliable witness. Documents can be lost, rewritten, or misinterpreted. Stone cannot. It only ages, and its age tells a story that paper often cannot keep up with. There is a noticeable difference between early architecture and mature architecture. Early architecture experiments. It adapts. It shows uncertainty. Mature architecture does not. It follows rules. It repeats patterns. It reflects accumulated knowledge. What makes many ancient buildings difficult to place in their official timelines is that they do not behave like early attempts. They appear fully realized. Entire districts emerge with consistent proportions. Structural systems repeat with confidence. Decorative elements follow established standards rather than tentative exploration. This level of maturity is not something that appears overnight. Architectural traditions develop through trial and error. Styles evolve gradually. Techniques are refined over generations. Yet in many cities, architecture officially dated to a single century arrives already unified, widespread, and technically assured. From my perspective, this is one of the strongest signals that something is missing from the story, because buildings that represent the beginning of a tradition should look transitional. They should vary. They should improve over time. Instead, what we see is standardization from the start. Columns follow identical ratios. Window spacing aligns across blocks. Structural loads are handled with precision rather than approximation. This suggests builders were not discovering how to build. They already knew. Another detail reinforces this. Mature architecture integrates seamlessly with infrastructure. Foundations align with streets. Basements match underground systems. Drainage and access points appear pre-planned rather than retrofitted. This level of coordination requires foresight. You do not design architecture like this unless the urban environment already exists or is being planned as a complete system. And that is where the timeline begins to strain. If these buildings truly mark the beginning of a new architectural era, we would expect growing pains. Instead, we see confidence, repetition, efficiency, which raises a difficult possibility. That what we are calling new architecture may actually represent the reuse or continuation of an older architectural language, not innovation, inheritance. From a historical perspective, this matters because once inherited structures are mistaken for newly invented ones, the origin of the system disappears. The architecture looks advanced for its time because it did not originate in that time. It was already mature, and when maturity appears without a visible development phase, history fills the gap with assumption. The result is a compressed timeline. Centuries of architectural evolution appear to happen in decades. Cities seem to rise fully formed, and buildings feel older than their dates because, in many cases, they are. This does not require hidden civilizations or lost technologies. It only requires acknowledging that architectural maturity is not instantaneous, it is accumulated. And when accumulation is missing from the record, something has been left out. There is something subtly unsettling about many historic cities when you study their earliest photographs. They don't look like places in the middle of becoming something. They look complete. Streets are already aligned. Building heights are consistent. Public squares feel intentional rather than improvised. These are not frontier towns. They are not experimental settlements. They appear organized, even refined, from the very moment they enter visual history. In most cases, early stages of city development are obvious. Roads are uneven. Buildings vary wildly in scale. Infrastructure is temporary, patched together, and visibly evolving. But many cities officially dated to rapid 19th century expansion skip this phase entirely. They emerge in photographs as finished environments. From my perspective, this is one of the hardest details to reconcile with conventional timelines because cities do not become coherent overnight. Urban maturity takes time. It requires layers of decision-making, revisions, mistakes, corrections, and yet, when we examine images from the supposed early years of many cities, those layers are missing. The streets already know where they're going. Buildings already know their place. Infrastructure already assumes permanence. This suggests not a beginning, but a continuation. Another detail reinforces this impression. Early photographs rarely show large-scale construction underway. There are no vast demolition zones, no chaotic rebuilding efforts, no transitional infrastructure struggling to keep up. Instead, cities appear calm, operational, occupied. That calmness is telling. It implies that what we are seeing is not the birth of a city, but the documentation of an existing one. In several cases, records describe massive urban growth happening rapidly, yet the photographic evidence shows environments that feel settled rather than rushed. From my perspective, this points to a disconnect between narrative and reality. Perhaps cities did grow quickly, but not from nothing. Perhaps they expanded by occupying and adapting what already existed. When that happens, the city feels finished early because it inherited structure. Streets align because they were already there. Buildings match because they belong to the same architectural logic. Infrastructure fits because it was designed as a system. This would also explain why so many cities share similar layouts across continents. Grid patterns, repeating block sizes, consistent street widths. These features are often attributed to modern planning, but planning implies foresight, and foresight implies that someone already knew what a functional city should look like. What makes this uncomfortable is not the idea of reuse. It's how quietly it disappears from the story. Once a city is labeled new, attention shifts to growth statistics, population numbers, and industrial milestones. The question of origin fades. Cities don't announce whether they are built or inherited. They simply function. And if a later society documents a city at the moment it takes control, that moment becomes history's starting point, regardless of what came before. That does not mean the city is fake. It means its timeline may be incomplete. And when cities appear finished too early, it is often because we are not seeing their first chapter. We are seeing the moment they were written into records. There comes a point when repetition changes the way you see things. At first, I treated these inconsistencies as isolated cases. A building here, a city there, each one had a possible explanation. Weathering, restoration, missing records. But repetition erodes comfort. When the same contradictions appear across continents, across climates, and across political systems, coincidence starts to feel like avoidance. What stands out to me is not a single structure, but the pattern. Buildings that feel older than their dates, cities that appear finished the moment they enter history, architecture that arrives fully formed, without visible experimentation. At some point, this stopped feeling accidental. Not in a dramatic sense, in a practical one. Because systems don't repeat without reason. From my perspective, the most telling detail is how quietly these patterns are accepted. They're not hidden. They are visible to anyone willing to look. And yet, they rarely trigger questions. I don't think this is because people are uninterested. I think it's because the explanations feel good enough. Dates exist, records exist, and questioning them feels unnecessary, even uncomfortable. But buildings don't care about comfort. They preserve their history through physical behavior. They settle, they erode, they integrate into cities in ways that reveal time. When that physical story repeatedly disagrees with the written one, curiosity becomes responsibility, not to replace history, but to refine it. I don't claim to know how many timelines are incomplete. I don't claim to know what came before. But I do know this. When patterns become impossible to ignore, ignoring them becomes a choice. And the moment you stop choosing comfort, a different story begins to emerge. Not a finished one, but a more honest one. At this stage, the goal is no longer to prove anything. The goal is to notice what no longer fits. When buildings appear older than their dates, when cities seem complete before their supposed beginnings, when architecture arrives without a visible learning curve, something in the timeline deserves closer attention. This does not mean history is false. It means history may be incomplete. Dates tell us when something was recorded. They do not always tell us when it began. And when documentation becomes the starting point, everything that came before quietly disappears. What remains is a clean narrative, but not always an accurate one. The value of examining these mismatches is not in replacing one explanation with another. It is in learning to ask better questions. Why does this building behave like it has centuries behind it? Why does this city feel inherited rather than constructed? Why do the same patterns repeat across places that were never meant to share a history? These questions don't demand belief. They invite observation. Because history is not written only in books. It is written in stone, in alignment, in proportion, in how structures settle into the world over time. If the physical record tells a story that doesn't fully match the written one, both deserve to be examined, not dismissed. And once you begin looking at buildings this way, it becomes difficult to stop. Streets feel layered, cities feel older than their names, and dates begin to look less like origins and more like chapters. If this exploration changed the way you look at the buildings around you, stay curious. Future episodes will continue examining architectural timelines, inherited cities, and the subtle clues that suggest our past may be more layered than we're taught to imagine. Not to offer final answers, but to document the questions history leaves behind, because sometimes the most important discoveries are not hidden underground. They are standing right in front of us, quietly waiting to be noticed.